the friendship is sharing deal.
Because I want one of your McNuggets.
And I need some of your Quarter Pounder.
There's a deal for everyone at McDonald's. Get one favorite like 10-piece chicken McNuggets, a Quarter Pounder, or a Big Mac, and get another for just $1. Price and participation may vary. Valid for item of equal or lesser value.
Luxury is meant to be livable. Discover the new leather collection at Ashley with premium quality leather sofas, recliners, and more, all built to last. No matter how many spills, scuffs, or pet-related mishaps come its way, the leather collection at Ashley is made with the durability you need for the whole family. Shop the new leather collection at Ashley and find chairs starting at $499.99 and sofas at $599.99. Ashley, for the love of home.
I want to tell you about Doing Justice, a new podcast from Cafe Studios. It's about a prosecutor's role in our justice system and is hosted by former U.S. Attorney Preet Bharara.
Wait, I know him.
The show asks if we should allow an elected official to run for re-election while under investigation. It follows a sex worker who was robbed and gets her day in court.
Preet explores the key elements of cases from the unique perspective of the prosecutors grappling with urgent moral and legal questions. Subscribe to Doing Justice wherever you're listening now.
This is Kathy from Chicago. Get exclusive podcasts and more at patreon.com/partnersincrimemedia, just like I do.
I'm Rebecca Lavoie, and this is Crime Writers On. Crime Writers On is the original true crime review podcast that digs into true crime, pop culture, other podcasts. And this week, stories about missing women of color. What happened to a Native American woman who left a bar in Montana and was never seen again? We'll review the new podcast from Gimlet's Connie Walker, Stolen, The Search for Jermain. Plus, an 8-year-old girl in a shelter vanished with the facility's janitor. Her family was let down not only by the justice system, but by the social safety net meant to help them. We'll discuss WAMU's Through the Cracks. Joining me to get that done and more is my real-life husband, true crime co-author, former TV journalist, and guy who gets frustrated when I don't treat this like a job, Kevin Flynn. Hello, Kevin.
Oh, are we doing a podcast now? I thought we were just standing around with the thing recording for a half an hour.
Listen, I love talking to my friends.
It's the water cooler aspect of your job.
Jeez. Yeah.
We did, for our listeners, just FYI, spend maybe like 15 minutes just chatting about shit before we started recording. Kevin was like, FYI. And I'm like, we don't have anywhere to go. What do you do?
The new Patreon level will be you also get the before show. In addition to the after show now, apparently.
Also with us is journalist, true crime author, former defense investigator, licensed private investigator, certified cat lady, and yes, also a certified pet detective, Laura Bricker. Hello, Laura.
Hello, Rebecca. There's some big pet detective cases going on, but I'll tell you about it later.
But Laura, can we just talk about, we're on Zoom right now, and you have 1,000 cats in your background.
Yeah.
This is the most Carol Baskin you have ever been on this podcast.
Yeah, I just was like, you know what? I'm going to start embracing the Zoom lifestyle. And my son, Will, was like, Mom, you're so stupid. You need a green screen. I was like, I don't care if everything fades out. I have like all these cats. It makes me happy.
Yes.
And I feel like it's sort of just like, it speaks to who I am.
It really does. And also with us, our captain of woke cynicism, the author behind the noir novels known as the City Trilogy, host of the Strange Arrivals podcast, and our Patreon book club host, Toby Ball. Hello, Toby.
Hello, Rebecca.
So, Kevin, question for you.
Yeah.
What can I do to make this more comfortable for you as a job? Just like not talk? We just like come on and start recording immediately? Like, what would help you?
I just mean, 20 minutes of ramping up, talking about stuff that, could actually be in the show.
All I know is that when Toby when Toby holds up his little alien ornament and puts it in front of his camera.
Alien, Toby.
Well, they can't really see this on podcast land.
No, but for someone who doesn't believe in aliens, you sure are committed to the bit, Toby. You really are.
I got this at at the Alien Garage. That's like a few miles from where Betty and Barney Hill supposedly had their encounter.
They did. You mean where they did have their encounter?
Yeah, but they're not entirely clear exactly where it happened. Anyway, there's this garage that just sells all these like alien tchotchkes and stuff. And so I bought this, a little green alien.
Nice. Wow. Well, that's appropriate.
It's not an actual alien, though. It's just a toy.
Oh, wow. And so you got the smallest one.
Yeah.
The cheapest one.
Thanks for clarifying that, Toby. I thought it was real.
I wasn't sure. I mean, it could
looks
be
like,
alarming.
It looks like
don't know.
Gumby, and it also looks like a thing you would have gotten. Remember those when we were kids, we'd go to the grocery store, and there were those machines you put a quarter in, you get like a bubble out, and there'd be something inside the bubble, and it was usually super shitty. And then once in a while, you got something like that.
Yeah, like an alien.
Wow.
All right, we have a lot to talk about tonight, so I think we should just go ahead and start our first review. What do you think?
Let's do it.
Yeah, why not?
Let's get it done. Leading off.
I said, something's not right. I just had that feeling.
Why did you have that feeling?
When she doesn't answer her phone and nobody else has heard from her, that's not Jermain.
In 2018, Jermain Charlo had a drink in a Missoula, Montana bar with a friend. After midnight, the 23-year-old mother of two walked down the alleyway, turned the corner, and vanished.
I honestly thought we'd find her that night. I 100% felt that way.
Jermain was the latest in a long line of Indigenous women who have gone missing or met with violence on both sides of the U.S.-Canada border. The question remains, did Jermain run away? Is she being sex trafficked? Or did something happen with someone she met that night?
When I started looking into the issue of missing or murdered Indigenous women in the United States, I quickly became focused on Montana. There are so many cases here. Why? What is happening to Indigenous women in Montana?
In Gimlet's new podcast, Stolen, The Search for Jermain, former missing and murdered host Connie Walker continues her work documenting crimes against Indigenous women. The 8-part series retraces Jermain's footsteps, tracks down suspects, and explores how her experiences as a Native American in Montana affects their lives and crimes. Programming note, you can listen to Stolen for free on Spotify, but not on any other podcast platforms right now. We are going to be talking about plot points from the first 3 episodes of Stolen. So if you want to remain spoiler-free, go to the estimated time code in our show notes for our thumbs up or thumbs down review. Toby Ball. So when I first heard that Connie Walker left CBC and went to Gimlet to make this podcast, I met her at a conference and she said, yeah, I'm making a true crime podcast for Gimlet. Part of me was like, yay, Connie Walker is getting like a big production company, a big platform. Part of me was also a little bit afraid that what we came to love about Connie Walker's style and her reporting and Missing and Murdered would somehow be, I don't know, glossified or trimmed away by like having all this production muscle behind her.
I know there are a lot of similarities between Indigenous people on both sides of the border, but there are a lot of differences too. I've never been to the Flathead Reservation before. I'm a stranger here. But I bet that whatever Jermain's story is, it's connected to this land and this place. And I want to make sure I get it right.
Do you feel like we are getting the Connie Walker we have come to know and love in this new podcast, Stolen?
Yeah, I wouldn't have noticed the difference. Like, if you didn't identify what the production company was, like, I don't think there's any difference. Like, she's clearly, it's like Connie Walker podcast, and it's got all those things that we like about Connie Walker's podcast. So nothing to fear there.
What do you think that she does that makes her so singular, Toby?
I was trying to think about this because I was writing notes, and it's like, what is it about the podcasts that I think are different than even other like excellent podcasts? And I think part of it is that I feel like there's sort of an intimacy that she brings to these stories. And I was trying to like, why does it seem that way? And I think part of it is her manner. She's just sort of very calm and kind, while also, she's there for the story. But there's just a lot more, I think, of her interacting with people in ways that aren't necessarily, they don't really add to like your knowledge of the facts of the story, but they do create an understanding of her and the people that she's talking to. And I think kind of creates this atmosphere where you sort of connect more on a personal or emotional level with the people that she's talking to. And some of these bit players you get more of a sense like maybe you'd met them briefly or whatever. I struggle a little bit to figure out exactly what it is that makes that so effective. But I think it's a combination of sort of production and then also her personality.
Laura, what do you think?
Yeah, I think what it is that she really puts her personality and her ethnic background right out there at the start of the podcast. And you know that she is compassionate, but I think also putting her background out in that way brings like a certain credibility to her reporting that you really trust what she's saying and you trust the way that she's out talking to people. I mean, it's Connie. When she is out there and you're listening to her talk to people and interview people, she's persistent, but she's not pushy and she's kind. But I think it comes across as somebody that is obviously very qualified to tell the story that she's telling, and also somebody that is extremely compassionate and really wants to help shed light on these issues with Indigenous women through her reporting, and that really comes through.
Yeah, I think that one of the great things is that she's always, when she puts herself into the stories, this podcast and the old Missing and Murder series, she comes at it as a Cree woman, and that becomes part of the story, but it doesn't become about her, right? So it really informs the way that she tells the story. And even in this one, where she's talking about the difference between being Canadian First Nation person and how that is similar but yet different than the experience of Native Americans, that it's like, okay, yeah, we're following along. You're teaching us like
it's
in
orienting.
A really interesting, in an interesting way. And the other thing is when she puts herself in, it kind of reminds me a little bit of Madeleine Barron when she does her thing. But Madeleine Barron, when she says something very kind of soft and like, subtle, she's smarter than what she's saying. And then she's like kind of like doing that to bring somebody in. Connie has also like this emotional intelligence. She's just very honest with people. And so you get a real sense of sort of who she is. She's polite, but she's also smart and she's also curious. And so you get all that with her.
I will say, if anyone is interested in the process that Connie Walker thinks about when doing this, I would highly recommend that you listen to an episode of a podcast called Longform, which, by the way, is an excellent podcast that talks with journalists and story makers about their process and how they do their work. Connie Walker has an approach to journalism about Indigenous people that is, I think, the right approach about journalism about communities like Indigenous people who are marginalized. She calls it story making, not story taking. So there is this very traditional model of journalism where you just fly in, tell your audience what happened, and the audience is supposed to make up their own mind. That's, sometimes appropriate. But when it comes to communities where everything has just been taken from them over and over and over again, appropriated, or even land or resources, like the approach to covering a population or a community like this is to work with them to tell the story that is the right way to tell it. And I know a lot of like old fashioned editors might be like, no, that's not okay. But it works. Like this is such evidence that it works, right? Like all the empathy we're talking about is like her going in there with the idea that she's not alone here. She's with her sources. And I think, Kevin, that even comes across, the main protagonist cop in this story, Guy, who would be very easy to cast as the white guy cop from the outside who wasn't able to solve this case. Even her approach with him and the way he comes across feels like story making with him, right? And he comes off pretty well.
He does. Look, we're not, by the way, the takeaway from that, I guess, is that we all would love to have coffee and pie with Connie Walker.
Oh, 100%. Okay.
So that's settled. Look, we have not had a problem with calling out shitty cops for being shitty cops. I think in this case, though, we feel like we've met like a really sincere, thoughtful law enforcement official. And, like if he's in Las Vegas on vacation and he can't sleep because he's still thinking about Jermain, I think that says a lot. I mean, if he puts his personal cell phone number on a billboard to get tips about her case, I think that's great. It shows somebody going the extra mile. And it also shows somebody, too, that is fully aware that he is a white law enforcement officer dealing with Native Americans and what that power dynamic is and the historical distrust that's there. He gets it. He gets it. And he understands, like, when he's sitting with people in the room, he's just trying to tell them that, no, look, I'm really sincere about wanting to do this.
But it's okay that you don't believe me. I understand.
It's okay you don't believe me. That's not the important thing. Because a lot of times it's the reverse. I want you to believe that I really care about this, but I don't.
If you have a missing or murdered female, how do you not treat that case like you would want somebody to treat your wife, your daughter, or your mother? It just doesn't make sense.
Now, so Laura, there were some law enforcement issues around Jermain's disappearance that we hear about. And we do hear that it was basically these activists, these nonprofit people who were really on the case before Guy got involved. What do you think of we hear Guy obviously being very charitable, talking about his colleagues, but it does seem like there were missing pieces to the beginning of this investigation, right?
Yeah, that was absolutely infuriating to listen to. And it's a good thing I got some new hot pink rage walking shoes this week, because that was a rage walking moment for me. Let me just say. I mean, listening to her family describe she hasn't come home, they can't find her, she's missing, and the police won't go out and do anything. And I'm like, what the I had some choice words and then I kept walking. But then to hear that it was actually a nonprofit that had been formed specifically for this purpose. And so that to me felt like, oh, wait a minute. So she's not the first person to go missing. She's not the last person to go missing. And it's such an issue that somebody on the outside actually needs to have an organized, ongoing effort to step in when there are cases like this to help out. To me, that was just like a huge sign of the overall problem. I mean, we still don't know what happened to her. We don't know where she fits into this sort of puzzle of, missing Indigenous women in Montana. But the fact that there was this group that is specifically helping in situations like this, it's clearly a big problem. And it was really freaking maddening to hear that this family just felt like nobody was backing them up.
Let's talk about Montana. Toby, Connie does ask the question, she doesn't say it like I would, which is what the fuck is going on in Montana? But there is a sort of extraordinary series of events in Montana and statistics in Montana that point to, as much as Connie has been reporting, remember in the first season of Missing and Murder, she talked about one stretch of road, or maybe it was the second season where all this, it was extraordinary, statistics along that one stretch of road. Montana as a state seems to have these extraordinary statistics. Toby, can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, she talks about how 84% of Native women suffer from some form of abuse, physical, emotional, psychological, or sexual. Half will experience a sexual assault. They have 10 times the chance of other women of being murdered. One of the shocking moments for me was when they're talking about how Native women, I guess girls, when they're getting older, one of the things that they are told about that they have to be on the lookout for is situations in which they could be kidnapped and sex trafficked. That's just another one of the things that you tell somebody they have to look out for.
It is interesting. I think she very efficiently explains. I think we hear the word sex trafficking a lot, but we don't know what it means, human trafficking. Mm-hmm. And she just very efficiently explains what that means and explains how it works. Kevin, were you surprised to hear that trafficking is such a huge concern in Montana, especially among this Native population? Yeah,
it's funny when you pick out Montana as sort of, you kind of what's with this state with those low population?
All I think about is the University of Montana, snow, fast speed limits, and desolate big sky. I mean, that's typically what you think about.
Yeah, but when you think about it, it does make sense that prostitution, either willingly or against their will, that Native American women would be trafficked, because when you talk about things like poverty and homelessness and addiction, these are all at-risk factors
and
for
conference attendees, apparently.
And conference attendees.
Fuck?
Damn. But also, it just seems like in all these stories that Connie talks about when a woman goes missing, just how sort of easy it just seemed like that they just walked out of a bar and vanished.
Yeah.
It wasn't door was kicked in or whatever, but it's so peculiar. But You know, when you talk about sex trafficking, the idea that there, you know, around the time she disappears, there was these 2 Latino guys walking around the reservation, scouting out for women
to buy.
It reminded me of 12 Years a Slave, when those slave hunters were there and just had dinner with the guy, and all of a sudden he wakes up and he's sold into slavery.
Yeah.
It's like the same thing. It's scary. You know, what's so weird is that, like, we just did this thing on Juarez. And it's this, part of it's kind of like the same thing. All these women go missing. But when you drill down, it's like, well, it's the cartels. It's this organized thing. Now, north of the border, all these indigenous women have been going missing. But why? I mean, is there an organization that's doing this? Is it just cultural? People think I can get away with it? It's just so weird. Yeah, I mean, I think that's what it is.
Yeah.
I think that's the lesson. Men, white men and Native American men realize, yeah, I can just beat a woman and I can dispose of her body because everybody gets away with it.
Yeah.
No, yeah.
Laura, weren't you so haunted by the description of Connie in that whole sex trafficking series? And we should say we have listened to the first 3 episodes of this podcast. And as the time of this episode dropping, there will be 2 available, Kevin? So, but there is this whole explanation about how marketable, quote unquote, Jermain would be in the sex trafficking market.
Thinking in the language of a perpetrator, right? She's very marketable. Tall, slender, exotic looking, dark hair, took care of herself, knew how to apply her makeup, very marketable.
We get that, which is chilling and stunning, but we also get this incredible TikTok of Connie doing the shoe leather reporting and retracing Jermain's steps that night and finding people who saw her. What do you think of that scene with the bartender, Laura?
That was amazing. We were talking earlier, I can't remember if this was before we started taping or not, about always like recording no matter where you are. And so we lead into this with Connie heading out. You can tell it's nighttime. She's going into bars. We hear like different music in different bars. At one point, there's one bar she goes in where there's this super creepy guy that just like won't stop looking at her. And I was getting kind of worried for Connie at that point. But then she goes, because I was like, oh, this does not sound good. But she goes into this bar and ends up talking to the bartender, who might be the owner. I wasn't quite sure. And he actually saw Jermain on the night she went missing. And at first you're like, oh, he's not really going to say anything. And you listen to her just gently keep asking him questions. And pretty soon out comes this whole story about how she was there. And oh, guess what? He talked to the police. So,
it was like a Law and Order episode.
Yeah.
And it was crazy.
Everything.
He remembered something from years ago, but in great detail.
She was on her phone.
Yes, what she was wearing.
Like, did you notice anything out of the ordinary about how they were talking?
No. She seemed more interested in her phone than the guy that she was with. She seemed more interested in texting back and forth with somebody on her phone.
She didn't care about the guy she was with. She was texting somebody else. And so then you're like, well, who is she texting? Who was she focused on? Why was she with this guy? But just the fact that he had that much information and she just happened to, by going out, it's like when you go out and you're like, okay, you got to knock on those doors because you never know what you're going to find out. That is a perfect example of why.
That's the one where you high five whoever you're with afterwards.
True.
When they can't see, like, oh, I can't believe I got that.
Oh, that's not the only time it happens. Toby, she's also out with Guy driving around. They pull into the alley and she happens to talk to the only person who has seen the video from that night that's like hours long of Jermain walking around in this alley behind this bar socializing. And she's with Guy and they're just whatever. And she's just like, wait, you saw the video? Like, don't you feel like it's Connie who makes these connections because she does have the wherewithal and the patience to really like interact with everybody in every scene? Like, I'm so grateful that she includes that in the podcast. What did you think of that, Toby?
Yeah, it was cool. I do. It does make me wonder, like, how many interactions does she have with people on tape that are fruitless?
That we don't
hear. to get to the point where something sort of seems to serendipitously work out, but in fact, it's probably because it's one of 40 conversations she had and this one actually like paid off. But it's just another interesting thing about the podcast, which is kind of full of, it's interesting stuff, and it's all in kind of different ways, right? Like some of it's interactions with people, some of it's history, some of it's sort of cultural critique a little bit. I mean, she talks about the sexualization of Native women and how the whole Pocahontas thing, that Pocahontas was a girl.
Teenager, yeah.
She was not a woman. And, there's a lot of interesting stuff. And that was one of the pieces.
Toby, Laura mentioned the scene earlier about Connie being in that bar where Jermain had worked on the reservation.
Yep.
And she just kind of makes the observation. And I loved it that they left this in the show where she just sort of talks about this man sitting in the bar who's incredibly, he's drunk. He's asking intrusive questions. It makes her uncomfortable. And instead of just like ignoring it or whatever, she tells us that this is the environment, this is the scene, this is where Jermain lived and worked, and this is what she's kind of subjected to.
He keeps staring at us. And honestly, it's making me uncomfortable. I can tell he's drunk, and he seems kind of pissed off about something. I want to leave before he can say or do anything else.
I'm curious as a guy, because this, I think, for probably me and Laura is a little bit more familiar, like being around men that just make us uncomfortable. And I don't think I would have the wherewithal necessarily to include that in a story I was telling, because I feel like for women, it's a common experience. I'm curious as a man, like, what do you think when you hear that scene? And how do you feel about Connie including that scene in this larger story?
Well, I mean, I think one of the things that she does well is to set up Jermain's life, right? And this is part of it. It's like, this is the environment that she's around quite a bit, in addition to, talking to people who are in her family. Was it her grandmother that she was talking
to?
Yep.
Yeah.
And talking about, where she lived. And I think there's a brief little bit where she talks about how Jermain, I don't know if it's her diary or somewhere, talks about how lonely she is. And Connie does it again when is she walking down an alley maybe? And she said she wasn't scared, but she was definitely sort of on guard.
She's walking away from the Orange Street market.
Yeah. So I do think it gives a sense of the environment that this stuff happened in very effectively.
Now, Kevin, this is a much larger story about, the fact that Indigenous women can go missing, that all these other forces, sex trafficking, poverty. And by the way, I will say one very graceful thing that Connie does is she acknowledges the poverty and the class differences, but she doesn't do that thing where she describes like what someone's house looks like to like put it in focus. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like she like tells you it without like, she's like, that's not important. It's not important to know, for instance, like what kind of furniture Jermain had. You know what I mean? But she does talk about that in all this context, but ultimately here we are in the story. And if listeners who may not have heard it, without spoiling too much, it may be someone she knows. It looks like it may likely be someone she knows that's involved. So it's both big and small, but one doesn't take away from the other, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, what we'll find out in the third episode, which will be out next week, is we'll find out more about who she was with at the bar that night.
Yeah.
Right? And I think it's really compelling because it gets said several times that, the person that you want to look at first is the last person that she was with. And there are some really interesting things about what that person has to say happened that night in different parts of their story. And, if she were on her phone with somebody else, how does that person react to that? So without getting too much into that, the shortest distance here to the solution may be that it's somebody that she knew, like a lot of homicides, right? It may not be this giant conspiracy or this giant systemic taking of Indigenous women left and right. However, I still feel like the through line is that if a man feels like a woman is disposable because all of the women before her were disposable, then that's something worth looking at.
She's just as much in peril from people she knows, people she doesn't know because of the situation.
Right. I mean, the thing can play out. You can hit, find, replace, and it could be a white woman in Greenwich Village. It could be a black woman in South Central L.A. It could be a woman in China or Europe or wherever, right? These dynamics play out between men and women a lot. But part of like what could be driving this if she were killed, which we don't know, but if she is the victim of a homicide, part of it could be that in this part of the world, women have just been vanishing and nothing has been happening about it. So what's the disincentive from killing somebody, right?
Right. Well, I think we should do what we do. Let's let our listeners know, should they check out Stolen? It's from Spotify Originals and Gimlet. It is available for free to listen to on Spotify. Just FYI, I know there's a whole conversation going around about platforms, what podcast is where. But this podcast is not behind a paywall. It is available to listen to on Spotify. And I want to see if you guys think it's worth listening to. So
that's why Alex and PJ got all that good money, right?
Well, let's be happy that Alex did. So Laura Bricker, what do you think? Thumbs up or thumbs down for Stolen from Gimlet and Spotify Originals starring our friend Connie Walker?
This is a big thumbs up. I love that Connie Walker is continuing to investigate these stories about Indigenous women and crimes committed against them, but also just bringing that sort of trademark compassion and empathy and just, I love her reporting style. And I listened to this as I was doing one of my jigsaw puzzles this week. I'm like 80 years old at this point, but it was just so engaging. And there was, moments where you felt great sympathy and moments where you felt great rage, but you came away feeling like you were learning something. So I would say big thumbs up for this.
Toby Ball, thumbs up or thumbs down for Stolen from Connie Walker, Spotify Originals, and Gimlet?
Yeah, I'm a big thumbs up. I mean, I kind of feel like in talking about this, it's a little bit hard just because it's like, and this was great, and this was great, and this was great.
You think it's boring just to love everything? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I mean, it's just hard to there's a lot to talk about. And some of the stuff we've already talked about on some of our other podcasts. It's a continuation of the last ones. I mean, she's got this project of looking at the situation of, Indigenous women in North America. And she looks at them from different stories. And I think what's been interesting is to see how each one has been a little bit different, starting with Missing and Murdered, the first one, which was really, it's like this. It was like a case of the disappearance of one woman and sort of Connie trying to find out what happened and also contextualizing it. And then Finding Cleo, which I think it's, I kind of put as one of the, sort of signposts.
It's a masterpiece.
It's sort of the evolution of podcasts. I mean, it's one of the real top ones, I think. And as I said before, I think it's sort of the most emotionally affecting one that we've listened to. And now there's this, and we're 3 episodes in, and it's great. I'm looking forward to the rest of it. So yeah, I mean, big thumbs up. And if you haven't listened to our earlier ones, I hope this inspired you to do so.
Kevin Flint.
Yeah, Connie Walker is to crimes against Indigenous women as Ronan Farrow is to the Me Too movement reporting, right? Or that Leah Satili is to militia terrorism, right? Maybe someday Connie Walker will do a great podcast about volleyball. But in the meantime, she should not stop doing what she's doing. This is her niche, and she brings a lot to it personally and professionally. She's got a very eager, clean, almost chronological style. It's good to listen to, very in-depth, and if you liked Missing and Murdered, those two podcast series, you're going to like this one. So I guess I'll just say thumbs up.
Yeah, no, I agree with all of you. I will say one thing that I disagree with Toby on. To me, this does not sound like the same or a continuation of Missing and Murdered. It's better. I know just because of money that there are a lot more resources behind this podcast than there were behind Missing and Murder, which I know that Connie just sort of did as a project at the CBC.
I hope she just got a bigger check.
No, she was a TV reporter, and she did the podcast sort of on the side on her own time, like how she could here and there. We've talked to Connie, we know this. She was hired to do what she does for Spotify Originals and Gimlet. And
do you ever meet someone who seems kind of off? Whether it's a creepy neighbor or random phone number that keeps calling you, Truthfinder has you covered. You can search for people by name, address, phone number, email, and more. Truthfinder can be especially helpful for running confidential background checks on anyone you're planning to meet from online dating apps. Go to truthfinder.com/podcasts for a special offer. That's truthfinder.com/podcasts to access your special offer today.
The friendship is sharing deal.
Because I want one of your McNuggets.
And I need some of your Quarter Pounder.
There's a deal for everyone at McDonald's. Get one favorite like 10-piece chicken McNuggets, a Quarter Pounder, or a Big Mac, and get another for just $1. Price and participation may vary. Valid for item of equal or lesser value.
Luxury is meant to be livable. Discover the new leather collection at Ashley with premium quality leather sofas, recliners, and more, all built to last. No matter how many spills, scuffs, or pet-related mishaps come its way, the leather collection at Ashley is made with the durability you need for the whole family. Shop the new leather collection at Ashley and find chairs starting at $499.99 and sofas at $599.99. Ashley, for the love of home.
I'm so grateful. They have let her be her. They have let her do what she does. And they have added great editing and incredible sound design to what she does and who she is. So, for people who have never heard Connie Walker's work before, they're hearing it in its most beautiful, produced frame. I don't know. I think this podcast is an achievement already. I've only heard a couple of episodes, and I cannot wait to hear the rest. Huge thumbs up from me.
Ba-da-ba-da, ba-da-ba-da, business time.
Oh, thanks for introducing that section, Kevin.
Business time.
You love that music, don't you?
The funny thing is, folks, I can't actually hear it while it's playing.
That's right, because I add it after.
Don't pull the curtain back too far, Rebecca.
We're eating cheese sandwiches right now. We're not recording a podcast.
Cheese sandwiches.
I'm just pulling the curtain back a little bit. Kevin's scratching his bum. Anyway.
I'm not doing that.
So we are here in the business section, Kevin. In the business section, we typically talk about things that are business-oriented. So, Kevin, what have we got going on our Patreon right now?
Oh, coming up on Patreon, we've got the Crime Writers on After Show.
What are we talking about there?
We've got a true crime update.
True crime podcast update.
About Curtis Flowers.
Yes.
He's got a nice settlement from the state of Mississippi and
a lady.
He's getting married.
Yes.
We'll talk more about that. We're also going to talk about how we deal with podcasts from friends and professional acquaintances, about how we choose what we're going to do if the people we know.
Yeah, so I do think it's an interesting conversation. I feel like I've known Connie for a long time. I actually just met the host of the next podcast we're reviewing.
You mean you met her once?
I met her once, but I feel like I've known her for a long time because I've interviewed her a few times. But the host of the podcast we're listening to next, I literally just met like 3 days before we decided to review her podcast. So it could have been awkward.
Okay, so that's going to be in the after show. There's a new episode of Leave It to Brick Her Out. The Case of the Kitten in the Ceiling.
Oh.
It's a good one. We have a new Married with podcast coming out later this week, and one of the questions has to do with a listener who's trying to develop intimacy after a sexual assault.
Oh.
So it's a really interesting episode. And coming up on These Are Their Stories, which will be out Wednesday, we've got an announcement about a new contest.
Yes.
Details to come up. By the way, if you'd like to learn more about things that we've got coming up and behind-the-scenes stuff and our tweet of the week, you want to see that cat of the week, you got to sign up for the Crime Writers On newsletter. Just go to crimewriterson.com. You can see right there, just drop in your email address, and every Monday you'll get a reminder of what's in the episode and other cool things.
Wait, can I just say something?
Yeah.
Our newsletter is freaking great. Like, Kevin, honestly, you've made the newsletter like it's a whole new experience.
There's enough content there that you could use it when you're on the toilet. You could, there's enough content, like,
Thanks,
it's not
Archie
one thing.
Bunker.
You could read the whole thing and you're like, that's good.
So even Laura, even you've noticed the newsletter, like, it's very Kevin now. When our newsletter has always been excellent. We've never had a bad newsletter, but Kevin has added a little punch of Kevin-ness to it that I think, like, elevates it a little bit, as Tan France would say.
Yeah, I mean, I never got it until recently, and I was like, I want to get the newsletter, and I said, Kevin, can you add me to the list? And I'm like, hey, there's a lot going on here, and I'm like, it's very entertaining. I mean, how many things do we get in our email inbox that we're like, delete, delete, delete? I'm not
all
reading
of
this
them,
nonsense.
all of the things.
But I'm always like, oh, what's Kevin have to say this week? And
I'm making a note. Add Toby.
It's the Kevin Flynn show.
It's very witty. Toby looked a little horrified by that, reading it on the toilet comment, but he's back now.
Toby just took off his jacket that he was wearing for the Tufts. You all right, Toby? A little warm over there?
Yeah, I'm letting cats in and out. It's just a lot going on here.
Oh my God. So apparently, I have to tell you, speaking of cats, Ken has informed me that when I tape on these nights, all of the animals line up just outside the door to come in here, and they all just lay on the floor and stare at the door until I come
Listen, what you're doing in there, it's a mystery to them, and it's a mystery to us too, Laura Bricker. All right, so Kevin, before we end the business section, do we have any Patreon patron saints of the week this week?
Our Patreon patron saints are Linda Larson and Julie Sutton. Bless you.
Kevin,
You took my line.
How can folks support us on Patreon if they want to get all this extra content and join our newsletter list and all that stuff? How can they find us on Patreon?
Well, in case you missed the first 3 fucking seconds of the podcast, it's patreon.com/partnership. partners in crime media.
You won't regret it. Join us on Patreon. Thanks so much. And thus ends the business
Turn off
section.
that music.
Moving on.
She liked riding the bikes with her brothers. She liked to race her brothers. She used to always win in the races on their bikes. She liked to play big sister. Well, not play. She was the big sister. She was the older sibling.
In 2014, 8-year-old Relisha Rudd had been missing from a Washington, D.C. family shelter more than 2 weeks before anyone noticed. Police searched for the shelter's janitor, who was spotted on video buying a shovel and trash bags. Authorities would later find Khalil Tatum and his wife dead, but never located Relisha.
First, it was this child is missing. Second, that this child was last seen in February. Third, this murder may be connected to her disappearance. So those were all the things unfolding in real time.
An investigation into the city's response to the case concluded the tragic events were not preventable. But the social safety net that should have benefited this family failed them long before they wound up in that shelter.
I mean, how can you have a young girl abducted at a shelter that's run by the city, and apparently she's taken by an employee of the city who works at this shelter, is missing for weeks before people at the school get in contact with family services? How does that happen before anyone notices?
In WAMU's Through the Cracks, host Jonquilyn Hill explores how Relisha Rudd's family got to that shelter, how a killer mingled among them, and how the different agencies involved wound up pointing fingers. Was her disappearance unpreventable, or was she just the latest victim of a system that doesn't value poor Black children? Now, we are going to be talking about plot points for Through the Cracks, so to remain spoiler-free, go to the estimated time code in our show notes to hear our thumbs up or thumbs down review. All right, so Kevin, this is a story that is about one case. Jonquilyn Hill, I think, does a great job orienting why she is telling the story of this case. She went to Howard University in Washington, D.C. She saw all the posters, and she kind of never forgot about it, and it stayed on her mind.
And her mom calls her.
Yeah, and it's one of those stories that's like a small story, but also a systemic story. And that's like an interesting story to like try to wrap your head around it and report, right?
Yeah, I think a lot of times when you look at a case like this and you want to cover it, try not to draw parallels with Connie Walker's piece there, but it's very easy to sort of like go forward. Here's what happened, and then let's take this sort of investigation forward. And this one, we're kind of looking backwards, right? It is called Through the Cracks, and that's the focus, and it stays on that. It's not just about her disappearance. It's not just about the things leading up to it, but it's also sort of working back from it, which is another way of looking at what led up to it, I guess, So I think in that way it's a little unique. That's the focus. Instead of it just being about a crime, it ends up being the crime is the way of getting into the examination of the issues. And
I have to say, Through the Cracks, a great concept for a podcast that can be about a lot of things.
A lot of things, yeah.
Yeah, I have to say, I'm always impressed when a media outlet comes up with a brand immediate, like Breakdown, for instance, or Uncover, that's like, oh, we could do anything with this, and that is that. Now, Toby, Jonquilyn makes a really clear editorial choice right at the beginning of the podcast to not hold back on who did it and what happened. What do you think of the structure of the podcast from that point of view? Because that's not typical for a true crime podcast.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's definitely, it's a bold choice. I think it makes sense in this case. I don't think you're meant to listen to this as a whodunit, like a lot of podcasts we listen to. I mean, this is really a sort of how did this happen? Why did this happen? Why couldn't it have been prevented? So knowing what the sort of outcome is, I think kind of allows you to not spend a lot of time thinking about, was it this guy? Was it this guy? Was it this guy? And you can really just focus on the story and the conditions under which the family lives. And some of the details about different people who are involved in the family are pretty harrowing. So yeah, it's one of those things where at first you're like, so where are we going now? But I think it's the right choice.
Now, Laura, this is a podcast about systems, and we hear a lot about the thing that links a lot of members of this family is trauma. One of the traumas that we hear about that I don't recall ever hearing about on any podcast that we've listened to about people who were living in poverty is the trauma of homelessness and eviction. And I'm curious what you think about that through line, because Jonquilyn, like the whole exploration here is to figure out if somebody fell through, what could have happened so they didn't fall through. And the homelessness and eviction thread is just a huge theme here. And I'm curious what you think of the storytelling there and the picture that was painted of that in Washington, D.C.
Well, I think it was a pretty horrific picture because I think it paints the homelessness in Washington, D.C. as something that's a huge problem, but also something that's not really being handled in a way that is actually going to create any sort of systemic change in ending that problem or moving that problem towards moving people out of homelessness. I mean, it seemed like, we don't want to build a playground because we don't want to see it. And we're going to put
No, they don't want to build a playground because they don't want to have the impression of permanence at a city shelter.
Yeah.
Which is insane, right?
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, it was just, and then you have people like living in a hotel for over a year, and you have a shelter that isn't even doing background checks on the employees that work there, and not only not doing background checks, but not even keeping track of things that might be nefarious, sketchy, whatever, with their employees that are working there. So nobody wants to accept responsibility for what happened in this case. So I think that this portrait of homelessness was very illuminating in terms of you really get a sense of what needed to be done and just where the attitude was towards this, like, we really don't want to deal with this, but we're going to just kind of do the bare minimum to kind of do something, but not really,
Kevin, what do you think about including this story about, how the family ended up in the shelter where this crime took place?
Yeah, I mean, tracing how the family got to the shelter in the first place is not something most reporters would look at as significant. It's prologue to a crime, and a lot of reporters would look at it as prologue. But in this case, the prologue is the story, right? It's looking at how this happened. I mean, what was preventable? I don't know what was preventable, but the fact is, if A, that family never got to that shelter, and B, that shelter never hired a convicted felon, this crime wouldn't happen. I mean, I think that's where the meat of the story is. You can look forward and talk about, whoa, this is what the city decided. Hey, the city decided, well, nothing can be done. What a surprise.
Yeah. How long was that report they wrote? 12 pages?
I forget.
How long do you think the script was for the podcast episode?
It was no 9/11 commission report.
All I could think about was she was like, they produced this like 12-page report, and I'm like, the script for this episode was probably like 50 pages.
Yeah. Oh, but by the way, you can get all the transcripts online. It was a good way to review. So
yeah. So, Toby, one of the things that I think is really extraordinary about the podcast is the sourcing. Antonio, who is Relisha's stepdad, is a primary source in this podcast. And Jonquilyn spends a lot of time with him telling his life story, talking about his trauma. It turns out he had siblings who were murdered. He also experienced homelessness from the same building where he and Relisha's mom were evicted.
Dana had a sister that's named Monica. She's deceased. She died when she was murdered when she was 2.
One of his little sisters was murdered when she was 2. I thought I was there to talk about Relisha, but it turned out that Antonio had already been through more than one trauma.
Then I had a brother, Andre. He's deceased. He was murdered too.
What do you think of Antonio as a source in this podcast and the stories that he is telling Jonquilyn and the way that she's presenting those stories?
I think he's one of the more compelling people that we've heard from in a while. His story is so traumatic, it's almost hard to believe what he's been through, and the role that he plays in the family, and really trying to protect the kids, and I think he's critical. I mean, I think he's critical to the story. I think he's tremendously sympathetic. I mean, he's sort of the opposite side of this guy Khalil, right? Who sort of presents himself in a similar way, but towards nefarious ends because he's grooming. Whereas Antonio seems to actually be in a situation of responsibility for his stepkids, right?
Yeah.
I mean, so anyway, I found him tremendously sympathetic character, and it's just like another sort of heartbreaking piece of this, like, sort of seems like unending list of tragedies in his life.
No, I agree. And the sort of nonchalance with which he just tells Jonquilyn that like his siblings were murdered, and then when she looks up the details, it was like a domestic murder. Like, it's so harrowing. And he's so hardened to sort of the trauma in his own life that he just is able to just like say it. I found that to be astonishing.
There was a passage in Stolen, too, same thing about someone saying,
yeah, my sister-in-law also went missing.
Yeah.
She didn't go missing. She was murdered. Like, it's fucking horrible. But just like the, the way that you can just say that as if it's something that happened and then you can just talk about another thing, it just really speaks to the level of constant trauma that I don't think anybody who's not in a marginalized community who doesn't live in poverty can relate to. But it's just presented in such a way that it just, like, I was walking when I listened to it and I just, like, found myself sucking in air. You know what I mean? Now, Laura, there is an investigative police, like, journalism aspect of this. We don't get it until episode 6. But I'm curious to know what you think about how the podcast kind of frames the police investigation, the reporting around this, because Jonquilyn does point out that Relisha's case actually got more attention than most little black girls' cases would have.
More than 99% of missing persons cases in D.C. are resolved quickly, but not this one. Little girls don't just vanish into thin air. There's always a story behind a disappearance, and Relisha's story was one that was years in the making.
So what do you think of this kind of law enforcement journalism lens into sort of the outside in looking at this case?
Yeah, I mean, I guess me personally, I wanted a little bit more of that up front. You know, we didn't get that until episode 5. And I understood the lens that the story is being told through, and that Relisha's disappearance and what led to her, being gone for, 18 days before anybody reported her missing. What contributed to that? And I understand that all of the family background and the homelessness and the poverty and the situation locally contributed to that. But I really, personally, I felt like I wanted to back into that after I heard more of the police investigation, because we did hear about that police investigation, in the most recent episode. And I think when we got into that police investigation part and also the investigation into her disappearance, I felt like the podcast was very sensitive to not portraying her family in a way that would have come across as negative. But I guess I came away feeling, I understand the situation they were in, but I was like, how in the world did nobody in this family communicate with each other for 18 days to keep track of where this little girl was? And I feel like there was sort of a resistance to go down that road. But that was, once we got into the investigation, that was really bothering me. And I felt guilty for it bothering me in a way, because I felt like, God, this poor family has been through so much. But at the same time, I was like, 18 days and nobody knows where she is?
But what's the name of the podcast, Laura? Through the Cracks, right?
Yeah.
And I think Jonquilyn is pointing to, like we heard like a little bit, we'll hear about this in the next episode. I am also reflexively, because Jonquilyn has set us up to not like immediately blame the mom, because the mom has been burnt by other media. There's a lot of mitigating circumstances here, which we don't know yet, right? We don't know them yet because we haven't heard them yet. But I can't help but think that the family support system is going to be one of the cracks too that we're going to hear about Relisha falling through, right?
Well, perhaps. I mean, I would hope so, because look, I'm with Laura. It's not denouncing the victims. It's not victim blaming, but it is troubling that for 18 days, nobody knew what was going on. And that's not necessarily a poor character trait, but it is problematic. And the fact that Jonquilyn at this point, excuses it.
Well, one way to think about it is, it's a really extreme example of something that can happen in a big, extended family. One parent is out of town, the other is busy with the other kids, the aunt and the grandmother are doing their thing. Wires get crossed.
If we're going to spend half of an episode looking at the landlord of the previous apartment and sort of implying, well, he has a role in this too. I mean, family members are supposed to also protect the children. And so the fact that that is not also addressed, or I'll at least say this, hasn't been addressed candidly yet, I think it's problematic.
Do you think it will be, though? I think it will be.
Well, I have no reason to believe that it wouldn't.
I mean, she said
other than there was the opportunity.
Yeah.
I mean, there was the opportunity, and she starts off by saying, look, I know, and right, it's way too easy to just, like, flame the mother because you don't know where your kid is, and, I mean, yes. Let's not do that. But, yeah, I mean, the family unit is a component of the system that broke down, and let's just not ignore that at all.
So I don't think the podcast is going to ignore it. I really don't.
Yeah,
only because
okay.
I've heard her say a bunch of times we're going to be talking about that.
Okay.
But I also, it is an interesting question sort of about the order.
But if they didn't, you would also say, right?
Right, but it's also an interesting question about sort of the order of the episodes.
Oh, yeah, sure.
I actually do like that we're looking at systemic stuff first. I do, because I think that if you start with what's happening with religious mom. We heard Antonio, by the way, was working out of town, like when a lot of this stuff happened.
Yeah.
So he's out of town. He hears from the school that a doctor has been calling the school and saying that Relisha isn't at school because she's with me. So you can easily put yourself in his head where he's like not really connected to the family physically at the time. And he's thinking like, oh, my stepdaughter went to a doctor and the doctor's saying she's not in school. That seems legit, right? Mm-hmm. So you can imagine all of that. We can't imagine the mother's point of view because Jonquilyn tells us up front the mother will not be interviewed for this. Like she tells us that. I think the solution here, and I think it works for me, knowing the mother isn't going to go on record, is to do all the things first where people will go on record. The cop, the housing people, the nonprofit people, the people who work around the shelter stuff and who can explain that. I think the stuff where you can't keep people on record is more complicated. So I understand the impulse to wait. I mean, to me, that's what I hear. But I don't disagree with you. Like, it is troubling. Like, Toby, it's a sticky issue, right? You're talking about a population. They have poverty. They have all these other things going on. And there's contextual stuff about they live in a shelter. It's not unrealistic to believe, like, you may have your daughter being with another family for a while because it's better than a shelter. But it also is sticky that it's such a long period of time, right?
Yeah, I mean, I've got my two reactions are, one, I wasn't living in D.C. at the time, but my sense is that part of the reason why this got more press than a lot of similar stories is because it's sort of a morality play that you can play out in the press about this mom dropping the ball with her kid, whether fairly or not. I mean, I guess the other thing I was just thinking about in terms of the order of things and how she hasn't really addressed the mother's culpability or lack of it yet. And I guess this is true to a lot of stuff we do. But when she's looking at the season, she's not necessarily trying to get in the stuff we want to hear at the time we review it. So if like some of the most compelling stuff, you want to keep to the end, and maybe that's part of what's compelling is that what she's found about this or further complicates things or whatever. So I just kind of, in this particular case, I just kind of assumed that we're going to get to it at some point because it seems like lunacy to not address it one way or the other. But yeah, I mean, it's, like you can try and be as non-judgmental as possible, but it's hard to wrap your head around as a parent, just like having no clue about where your kid is for 18 days. I mean, it's a good period of time.
Yeah, one quick point on the coverage before everybody in Washington starts patting themselves on the back for like, oh yeah, we actually covered
a black kid.
A black kid. Well, imagine for a second that unassuming 8-year-old black girl was abducted from the suburbs or a project and not a city shelter where there's also a juicy political scandal attached to the story.
Yeah.
Let's see if it also gets the same amount of
And it
coverage.
wasn't 18 days. Yeah. It's interesting. Like, I think one of the reasons why the fact that the family angle hasn't been covered yet is because, yes, I have questions about why 18 days went by. But I do also have questions about 18 days at school. And I do have questions about 18 days.
Well, it sounds like you get 10 days of unexcused absences,
right.
and that's when they...
And it sounds like it happened a lot, though, right? And it sounds like, there were other opportunities here. And, what was the podcast we listened to recently about a boy in London who was murdered?
C.J. Davis?
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's a place with a huge social safety net where there were also cracks and failings, right? And I'm thinking about just sort of like the infrastructure of the social safety net in the UK versus the United States, and how basically this podcast is exposing that. Let's just say, for argument's sake, and I'm not saying that this is true, but for argument's sake, let's just say that Relicia's mom didn't care, was absent, didn't care. I mean, I don't know anything about her, but somebody else should. You know what I mean? And I think that's kind of the larger point here, is that there should be a place to land, even if maybe one of these 10 people doesn't do what they're supposed to do. There are 9 other people who could. You know what I mean?
Right.
Well, I think the problem was that they thought Khalil might have been one of those people.
Yeah.
The incarceration rates for African-American men are so high that, I don't think that being an ex-con necessarily carries the same weight that we might think it does. I mean, otherwise you'd have tons and tons of unemployed. You have tons and tons of unemployed people, but just for the sheer percentages, I think that's not necessarily the sort of warning light that I think that you might sort of reflexively think it is.
Right.
So I think it's a fairly common experience. But I think that's also what means, just because a guy had spent time in jail, that doesn't necessarily mean that you don't trust him.
Right.
I mean, it's just
And
another
Jonquilyn says
that.
that. She says that. Yeah, she says that the unemployability of incarcerated people is another issue. That's also a problem, right?
Yeah.
I don't know. I do feel like there's a lot of angles going on here. What are you going to say, Lara?
Yeah, so there's plenty of red flags where people call him Uncle Khalil and the Godfather, and he's clearly she was not the only young person that he was taking an interest in. And, I don't know. I think my red flags would have been going up. But it wasn't just one person. I'm surprised nobody else's red flags went up.
Shamika was like, did you know he was her godfather? No, he's not her godfather. And I told him to his face, you're not her godfather. Stay away from my daughter. So Shamika, keep Alicia away from this man. Did she listen? No.
I can't imagine a scenario, though, where I have no childcare, I'm in poverty, I'm living in a shelter, and somebody's being nice to my kid, and maybe I see only trusting relationships. I can't not imagine it. Let me put it that way. You know what I mean? There's a lot going on here.
Yeah.
So I think we should do what we do. Let's let our listeners know, should they check out Through the Cracks? It's a new podcast from the public radio station WAMU. By the way, the first narrative investigative project this station has done so far. Lara Bricker, what do you think? Thumbs up or thumbs down for Through the Cracks?
Yeah, I'm going to go with thumbs up with this. I think that this is a case that is really effective at taking one case that is really heart-wrenching and using it to illustrate a much bigger societal issue. There's some things I wish it had been told me personally, my personal preference. I just wish it had been told in a little bit of a different order. But overall, I don't think that really affects the story and the impact of the podcast. So, I think it's definitely a thumbs up.
Toby Ball, what do you think?
Yeah, I give it a thumbs up. It's really interesting. It's the kind of stuff I find interesting to listen to. Again, it's like you use a case as a entry to examine larger societal forces. I think there's some super compelling voices in this. I also lived in DC for a while, so some of the issues I'm pretty familiar with from back then. So yeah, I liked it a lot. I was a little bit worried about somebody having to have a podcast reviewed on the same night as one of Connie Walker's, but she made it through. So I give it a solid thumbs up.
Kevin Flynn.
I'm also a thumbs up. I think it's a great compliment to the Stolen podcast, where we're looking at similar issues here. It's, does society value these people? And in this case, it's an argument that perhaps it didn't. Again, my criticism, it's a qualified criticism because we haven't gotten to the end, and perhaps a little more about looking at the family dynamic is something that's going to be handled in a way that is authentic and important to the audience, right? We say about, do you betray the subject or the audience? Well, we're not here to, make the family feel good. We're here to look at the issue. But even still, I'm still giving it a thumbs up. I think it's a really great examination, and we'll probably have another Through the Cracks in the near future.
Yeah, I really love this podcast. I'll tell you, I think Jonquilyn Hill is a star. I'm sorry, like she's never hosted a podcast before, a narrative podcast. She's a talk show producer on 1A. I think she used to work at a TV station as a producer. I think the writing in this podcast is so strong. You know, just the expository writing. I don't think that a lot of our listeners understand how hard it is to do expository writing in a narrative show where you are the voice for most of it, especially in a pandemic where you're not able to get so much field tape. I just found so many things about this podcast so strong. I love the angle. I love the point of view. I love the fact that they're taking this story and using it to tackle things like housing issues and city politics and the optics of homelessness, like all the things that other podcasts just kind of ignore or gloss over or go over quickly. I think it's a very, very, very...
Do you ever meet someone who seems kind of off? Whether it's a creepy neighbor or random phone number that keeps calling you, Truthfinder has you covered. You can search for people by name, address, phone number, email, and more. Truthfinder can be especially helpful for running confidential background checks on anyone you're planning to meet from online dating apps. Go to truthfinder.com/podcasts for a special offer. That's truthfinder.com/podcasts to access your special offer today.
The friendship is sharing deal.
Because I want one of your McNuggets.
And I need some of your Quarter Pounder.
There's a deal for everyone at McDonald's. Get one favorite like 10-piece chicken McNuggets, a Quarter Pounder, or a Big Mac and get another for just $1. Price and participation may vary. Valid for item of equal or lesser value.
Luxury is meant to be livable. Discover the new leather collection at Ashley with premium quality leather sofas, recliners, and more, all built to last. No matter how many spills, scuffs, or pet-related mishaps come its way, the leather collection at Ashley is made with the durability you need for the whole family. Shop the new leather collection at Ashley and find chairs starting at $499.99 and sofas at $599.99. Ashley, for the love of home.
Smart point of view for a show like this. My only tiny quibble about this, and you know, this is a resource issue. I know I work in public radio. I wish the music package were a little bit more dynamic. That's just my only complaint. In every other way, this thing
Somebody's running down the hallway, WMAU right, AMU right now. Going,
I know, you got to like buy packages. It's a lot, or resource packages. It's a whole thing. But I think the podcast is really, really strong. So big thumbs up for me for Through the Cracks. Now it's time for my favorite part of the podcast, a little something I like to call the crime of
the week.
Police in Tulsa, Oklahoma captured a burglary suspect red-handed and red-mouthed. The owner discovered a front window had been opened and believed the intruder left once it was clear someone else was home. Nothing was taken, but cops found a bag of Cheetos and a water bottle by the window. Outside the house, they bumped into Sharon Carr, who had a mouthful of that flaming orange Cheetos residue. These crack investigators put 2 and 2 together and arrested Carr for first-degree burglary. Authorities did not provide a motive for the break-in or an explanation of why the suspect brought a snack. One thing's for sure, eating a bag of Cheetos makes fingerprinting a whole lot easier.
You don't even need ink.
So panel, do me a favor. Come up with a new marketing slogan for Cheetos, the new food for criminals on the go. Laura Bricker, what do you think?
How about got sticky fingers? Don't forget to lick and swallow.
Toby Ball, what do you think? What's a good new marketing slogan for Cheetos that perhaps isn't as dirty as Laura
Is that really for
Bricker's?
criminals, Laura?
It's shoplifters, Toby. Shoplifters.
Oh, okay.
What do you think, Toby?
Wait, what was this question again?
A new marketing slogan for Cheetos, the new food for criminals on the go.
Oh, I was thinking more the cop angle, like cheese dust for Prince with Cheetos.
What do you think, Kevin?
Steal all you want. We'll make more.
Oh, perfect. All right, I think it's time to wrap up. But before we do that, Laura Bricker, do we have a cat of the week this week?
Well, clearly, since I'm sitting here with like 5,000 cats around me, we know it's a cat week. So I have to give a shout out to our favorite podcaster friend, Josh Baker.
Host of I'm Not a Monster.
Yes, who I identified as a fellow cat person while we were listening, and he was doing a Zoom call in one of his last episodes, and his cat toys were in the way. So I when he listened, I found out, in fact, he is a crazy cat person. So Josh has a black cat named Juno. And we've been having a back and forth about cats this week on Twitter. And so I let Josh know it's okay, totally acceptable to play hide and seek with your cat, because I do it all the time. Apparently he does. I'm sure Toby Ball plays hide and seek with his cats.
I don't.
Toby, don't lie. It's okay if you do, Toby. I'm normalizing.
I would happily admit to it, but I don't.
I'm just telling you, I'm totally normalizing that behavior. So, Josh, I love your cat, love, and Juno looks like a very nice cat.
I have something to say about Josh that I will say in the after show. I'm going to leave it there. Laura Bricker, if folks want to reach out to you on Twitter to pitch their pets to be Cat of the Week, it doesn't have to be a cat, by the way, and there's lots of other ways to pitch it. You can send us an email at crimewriterson@gmail.com or go to our Facebook group. But if they want to do it on Twitter, Laura, how can they find you there?
They can find me at Laura Bricker.
And Toby Ball, folks want to reach out to you and see a picture of your Tufts jacket or perhaps your little gummy alien that you like to put up to the camera while recording this podcast. How can they find you on Twitter?
At TobyBallNH.
And Kevin Flynn, if folks want to reach out to you on Twitter and say, hey, Kevin, how can they find you?
I'm at Kevin P. Flynn.
And if you want to follow me on Twitter or Instagram, you can find me at Reb Lavoie. Lots of photos of dogs and hot water bottles wearing tweed jackets. You can also follow the show on Twitter at Crime Writers On, and I encourage you to join our amazing, award-winning, fan favorite Facebook discussion group at the Crime Writers On Facebook discussion group. Just look it up. Support this show on Patreon at patreon.com/Partners in Crime Media, and you will get the Crime Writers On After Show right now, plus Married with Podcast, Toby Ball's Deep Dive Book Club podcast, and Laura Bricker's Leave It to Bricker podcast. Our theme song was composed and performed by Ty Gibbons. Our line editor is the very handsome Olivia Burdett. The executive producer of this fine podcast is the very fine Kevin Flynn. This show was recorded in the Yoga Loft above the Bodega in Bay St. Louis, Mississippi studio, otherwise known as Studio C, the closet in our New Hampshire basement, where Kevin spends hours searching Apple Podcasts for shows that are only on Spotify. On behalf of all the crime writers, thanks so much for listening. We will catch you later. Laura, can I just tell you something?
What?
Today I got to teach somebody a euphemism I learned from you.
What was that?
See you next Tuesday. Which I literally somehow completely missed in my life before meeting you when you referred to somebody as a see you next Tuesday.
Sorry, because you just call him a...
No.
You didn't know euphemism?
That's a bad word. I say see you next Tuesday. See you next Tuesday. It's like in the South and they say, oh, bless you.
Now listen, I do love those C words so much. I just call people T like all the time. I'm like, oh, it's kind of T. Kevin, I always forget that it's objectionable to people.
Luxury is meant to be livable. Discover the new leather collection at Ashley with premium quality leather sofas, recliners, and more, all built to last. No matter how many spills, scuffs, or pet-related mishaps come its way, the leather collection at Ashley is made with the durability you need for the whole family. Shop the new leather collection at Ashley and find chairs starting at $499.99 and sofas at $599.99. Ashley, for the love of home.